It's on. Hey, Marines, has anybody seen this book? Marines the Garden of Eden. Before this morning, you walked by and had seen this book? All right, you all know it's on the college read list? Yes? Yes, sir. Well, you see who those that forward to read it, the ones that back can't. Mr. Richard S. Lowry wrote this book, as well as Big Don, and a host of other books, a host of other magazine articles, from Victor Gazettes, documentaries. This individual who wrote that book is one of our duty experts in the world, award-winning writer, and Marine sailors. We got him this morning to talk to us. Give him join me in a well-rounded applause for Mr. Richard Lowry.
Good morning, Marines. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me today, Colonel. And it's really an honor to be here to talk to all of you Marines today. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope I don't bore you all to death in the next 6 hours while I talk. I want to tell you a few stories about Nasiriyah and Fallujah, but before that, I felt it necessary to give you some real PME stuff and talk about some lessons learned from Nasiriyah and Fallujah. And the two presentations that you had just earlier were wonderful in summarizing what happened in Nasiriyah and Fallujah. And I'm going to try to tie it together and make it so that you can all see how it affects you as an individual Marine and what you can do to become a better Marine because of the actions in Nasiriyah and Fallujah. Now, Nasiriyah was the first major battle of Operation Iraqi Freedom. You heard Gunny Schaefer tell you that they moved into a camp in Camp Shoup in northern Kuwait that was basically just a sandbox. They spent a month there and then rolled into Iraq at the beginning of the invasion in 2003. And the first major resistance encountered in the invasion and the move to Baghdad was at Nasiriyah. And Gunny Schaefer did a much, much better job of telling you that overall story than I could ever do. He was the eyes that led the Marines into Nasiriyah. And I thank him for his service. I think he did a great job. But there were many, many things happened in Nasiriyah that shouldn't have. Everything went wrong that day, and I'll get to that later. Fallujah, on the other hand, was the largest battle in Operation Iraqi Freedom. It involved over 10,000 coalition forces fighting anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 insurgents that were entrenched in that city. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. I'll give you a big picture on the Battle of Fallujah so that you can get some lessons learned out of that. And I have some interesting stories to tell you as well. But before we go into our journey of Operation Iraqi Freedom, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the history of Marines as an amphibious force. Let's go to this. Today, you're preparing for low-intensity conflicts. But let's back up in your history. And I guess the beginning of the history of the amphibious force is at Tripoli, when the Marines went ashore in small boats. And loosely, you could say that those small boats were the beginning of amphibious vehicles, but they were nothing more than small boats on smaller ships. The real beginning of your history, I believe, was at Tarawa with the amphibious tractors. that carried the 2nd Marine Division ashore in Tarawa in one of the most famous battles in the history of the Marine Corps. I won't go into that. You had a PME on that earlier. But I view that as the beginning of assault amphibians, were those amphibious tractors that they used. They were upgraded and redesigned and made better over the course of the years, specifically for the Marines and their amphibious capabilities. In Vietnam, they were nothing more than a giant armored shoebox. They did make amphibious landings, not under a lot of duress, but I imagine that many Marine from Vietnam is thankful that they had someplace to take cover in the jungles. They did a good job in Vietnam. It wasn't toward the end of the Vietnam War that the AAV came to be born. And it's your AAVs. You got to remember that the vehicles that you are working with and depend upon are 40 years old. They're older than all of you. Not quite older than me, but they're old. Okay? And you're probably not going to get any new vehicles anytime soon. But let's talk not just about the vehicles, let's talk about the strategy and the mission for a minute. One of my all-time Marine Corps heroes is General Al Correa, former Commandant of the Marine Corps. And I believe he is the father of the modern-day Marine Corps. And I wanted to just bring up a couple of things about General Gray that you may not know. General Gray basically developed the strategy for what he dubbed Marine amphibious units and Marine amphibious brigades, which changed over the years into a Marine expeditionary unit and a Marine expeditionary brigade. He developed the TTPs and the training to make Marines, amphibious Marines, in a low-intensity world, for low-intensity conflicts. He's one of the first military planners after Vietnam to sit down and say to himself and plan for the fact that the Soviet Union may not be our only enemy in the world, and that you may be forced one day to deal with low-intensity conflicts. Well, he was right on with that, and I personally thank him for developing new concepts and special operations capable concepts. He was the father of those ideas. Also, to step back one step farther, the Marines after Vietnam or all the way up until Vietnam, were an infantry-centric fighting force. They were infantry, boots on the ground. They were moved around by amphibious capabilities. They may have even been lifted by helicopters a little bit, and driven around in trucks and walked an awful lot. But they were infantry. General Gray, wanting to be more productive in the overall defense of America against the Soviet Union, decided that he wanted to make Marines a mechanized infantry force. And he is the one that had the idea of taking the AAV and mounting Marines atop for security and doing inland penetrations and basically using the AAV as an infantry fighting vehicle or armored personnel carrier to get you guys into the fight in Europe against the Soviet Union. I mean, there's a world-famous training event that was conducted in Norway where he took the entire 4th Marine Amphibious Brigade and he demonstrated these tactics, and he actually won the war game by sending his Marines deep into enemy territory and capturing the enemy's command post in the war game. So he developed the concepts, TTPs that you need for low-intensity efforts, and he also turned the Marines into a mechanized infantry force, which was very, very important in Desert Storm, and then again in the March to Baghdad in 2003. The largest, longest military penetration was in 2003 when the Marines moved to Baghdad. And you did it in your tracks and tanks and trucks. So now you have missions like Neo and Trap, and you are the Muse or the Nef spearhead. You have to be ready for large-scale conflicts as well as low-intensity conflicts. And always, you are the guys that lead the amphibious assault force. You've got to get those Marines ashore. And that will always be in the charter, I believe. Some people think that amphibious vehicles or amphibious assaults are a tactic of the past. I don't. I was talking with young Schaefer about this last night, and I remembered from Operation Desert Storm, which was the first book I wrote, was the Gulf War Chronicles about Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein had 10 divisions that he stationed along the coastline of Kuwait in anticipation of a Marine amphibious assault. 10 divisions stayed and waited, even when they knew that the army was sweeping around the other side, waiting for that amphibious assault. So the power of the threat of amphibious assault is immeasurable. 10 Army divisions he left sitting in place waiting for you guys to come ashore. If we were to remove that amphibious capability from the Marine Corps and say, well, fly them in an Ospreys. I mean, they're fun to fly in Ospreys, sort of like going downhill in a closed refrigerator, but if you had only a vertical capability, then the enemy wouldn't have to take those 10 divisions and defend the coastline. We need that capability. One of the powers of our military is our diversity, our ability to attack in so many different ways. I'm a former submarine sailor, and I love the SSGN submarine, which are converted Trident submarines to carry 150 Navy SEALs and 150 cruise missiles. You could fight a war with just one submarine. But you have those submarines, you have amphibious assaults, MEWs, MEVs, MEFs. You have airborne troops. The Army, let the Army jump out of helicopters. Yeah, that's fine for them. We're going to come ashore with them. So I'm definitely in favor of Marine amphibious capabilities. So, if Marines are in combat anywhere, from this point forward, you guys are going to be here. And if what you just heard earlier doesn't convince you of that, you need to find another job. Because you guys are the heart of the Marine Corps. Okay? They don't need your tracks, they need your provisional rifle. Okay? You're going to be in the next crisis, so you need to be prepared. Let's go to the next slide. So you as a Marine, the Marine Corps is strong because of you. Okay? And it's only as strong as its weakest link. So none of you want to be that link. So you need to stay strong. You need to stay strong in body. And I know Marines are always strong in body. But you need to stay strong in mind as well. Okay? And you need to expect the unexpected. Just look at the last 15 years, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You fought in the mountains, you fought in valleys, you fought along rivers, you fought in urban environments, in desert environments. What's next? Think about if you have to fight in or take an action in a major urban environment, where you may have to be fighting with your Amtraks adjacent to high-rise buildings. How do you deal with insurgents that are 30 stories up? Or maybe you're going to be tasked with driving your tracks, doing an assault through a subway tunnel. You have to be prepared for everything. because your tracks and your Marines will be involved in whatever happens. And we don't live in a safe environment. Today, we live in a very, very dangerous world. I can stand here and rattle off many places where you could end up next week. Syria, North Korea, Egypt, Lebanon, the Philippines. You know, I had a book signing several years ago, and it was right after the Iraq War had just started up. And I think it had been underway for 2 years or so. It was when Marines in the Navy came out, I went to Camp Pendleton to do a book signing. And there was a young Marine that was with me that had written the book. He had been in Ramadi. And he'd done his tour in Ramadi, and he said, you know, I got sent on a Pacific view. And he thought that a 6-month cruise in the Pacific would be a wonderful way to decompress from being in Ramadi. And he said, and I just came back from 6 months of fighting insurgents in the Philippines. You know, so there's plenty of bad guys out there, and there's plenty of areas where we as Americans, me, my family, need your protection. So stay prepared and be ready for anything. Well, let's do the next slide. So, mentally, this is another one of Al Gray's favorite points. First of all, you need to learn your job thoroughly and do it right and be the best you can possibly be at your job. But then you need to learn the jobs of your leadership 2 levels above. Now we have an excellent lesson learned from Gunny Schaefer. He lost his platoon sergeant and he lost his platoon commander in the middle of one of the nastiest fights in Iraq. He was, because of the lack of communications, which we'll talk about that in a little while too, but he was, in effect, to the best of his knowledge, the track's platoon commander in a nasty, nasty fight. If he didn't know what to do, we would have lost a lot more Marines that day. So, learn the jobs of your immediate leadership and then his boss too. Now, obviously, you know, you would say, well, you need to do that because if a Marine goes down in combat, you can replace them and it's seamless and the Marines can go on toward their objective. But there's another reason. If you look back through history, the Marine Corps has been a roller coaster ride. And what I mean by that is, every time there's a need for Marines, there's a very rapid buildup and escalation of the force. The Marines go off, get the job done, and then as the war winds down, the American people say, oh, war, we got better things to do. Cut the military. And the Marine Corps has stood down. It happened after World War I. There was a rapid buildup that was required for World War II. It happened after World War II with Korea. If none of you have read the story of how the Marines deployed in Korea, it is amazing. They got, it was like 30 or 60 days, they put an entire division together and landed in Incheon. It's an amazing story. Again, not one for today. And another amazing amphibious assault, by the way. It happened after Korea. It happened after Vietnam. We wound down after Vietnam, and Sergeant Schaefer just mentioned how there was a lack of preparedness going into Iraq and Korea. And it's happening now. So what's going to happen is your ranks are going to be reduced. So when the next flag goes up, when the next emergency comes, you guys are going to be the core of the building of the new Marine Corps. So if you know the jobs of people above you, you can move into those slots and train the young Marines that are coming up behind you. So it's very, very important to be maintaining the strength of the Marine Corps. Not to mention that it will help you in your events, knowing the jobs of others. This is how it is. This is how it's been in the Marine Corps forever. We need to learn to do more with less. That nasty old word sequester is not going away soon. Military budgets will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I fear that the Marine Corps will get a smaller and smaller and smaller slice of the pie within the Department of Defense. So you learn to do more with less than what you have. So you need to take care of what you have now. You need to clean, inspect, and maintain your equipment. Your tracks especially. Those vehicles are old and they need to be available when you need them. Gunny Schaefer told me a phenomenon last night that I wasn't aware of, and that was before Operation Rapid Freedom. Within the Assault Amphibian Battalion, people that were responsible for tracks, they got shit from their peers if something was wrong with their tracks. You know, and, oh yeah, your track is not as good as his track. Mine goes faster, whatever. One point that I want to make is that don't succumb to that peer pressure. If there is something the matter with your equipment, you need to report it and document it, because your leadership can't do anything if they don't know that there's something that needs to be fixed. And the reason I bring this up is that the tanks that were in Nazareth were reserve tanks. They were reserve tankers, and what happened with the quick deployment, when Gunny Schaefer was saying when they had to get on the ship so quickly, the tankers came from Fort Knox and up in that area, and they met up with the tanks that were here from 2nd Tank Battalion. Well, 2nd Tank Battalion didn't want to give up their good equipment, so they gave them all their dogs and tanks. Okay? So they had all sorts of maintenance issues going over and trying to get those tanks up and operational for the invasion of Iraq. They managed to clear all those maintenance items while they were at sea and when they first got to Camp Sugar, but it was a nightmare for them to get ready. So the leadership has to know the status of the equipment so that they can act and make sure that you have the best possible. Again, you need to take care of your equipment. That's your helmet, that's your rifle, that's your track, because you're not getting anything new anytime soon. The way next please. You know, I mentioned earlier that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was the largest inland penetration of any military fighting force throughout history. And many tanks and AAVs barely made it to that. It was 100 miles trip, I think, like 300 miles. And they certainly came back in very bad condition after their initial invasion. Tracks especially, because they were roaming all over southern Iraq. War tracks with Pastor Sorrow. It reminds me of Shakespeare, and I can't get up here as give a PMA without quoting Shakespeare. In the Shakespeare play Richard III, Richard is a nasty king of England, and he gets involved in a war, and on the middle of the battlefield, his horse is shot out from under him, causing him to lose the battle and his life. And in the middle of that battle, when he loses his horse, he says, my horse, a kingdom for a horse. When he was in it and stuck on that battlefield, he would have done anything to have that horse. The tracks of your horse. Make sure that they are available when you need them. Your track is not going to do anybody any good stuck in the well-bed or broken down along the side of the road. Make it your job as part of being a Marine to make sure that you can do mobility to get that track where it needs to go so that it can be used in the proper fashion. Okay, enough lecturing. Let's move on. Let's try to pull together the Battle of Nazareth and the Battle of Fallujah. And there are some interesting connections. The commanding general of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade in 2003 was Brigadier General Richard McConaughey. And he's the one that got me started in writing all my books and everything. He's been a great help to me. And I'm certainly an admirer of Richard McConaughey, who has since retired. He was not only the brigade commander for Nasiriyah. After Nasiriyah, he came home, just like the entire force did, and then he was reassigned and promoted to Major General and became the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, and he was the commanding general during the Second Battle of Fallujah. So, you'll see in my talk in the next few minutes and the stories that I tell, that many of the lessons that we learned in Nasiriyah were directly applied in Fallujah, and in my opinion, saved many, many, many Marines' lives. So let's talk about Nasiriyah and the types of things that went wrong and what we learned from Nasiriyah. First off, AAVs, although General Gray thought that they would be a great idea to make them for mechanized Marine forces, they're really not suited for long road marches. Now, AAVs were designed and built to bring Marines ashore and provide them with supporting fire and logistics capabilities. So long road marches take a heavy toll on your tracks. So you just need to be aware of that. The first lesson that I would say would be learned from Nasiriyah. They're also vulnerable to RPG and heavier weapon attacks. You saw the direct results of that in some of the photographs. The vehicles that were taken out in Nasiriyah. And I'll show you some more from Fallujah in a minute. Okay. Again, Gunny Schaefer pointed this out very eloquently in his story telling of his personal experience in Nasiriyah. But comms are very, very important. One of the issues in Nasiriyah, you remember him talking about Bravo Company taking off out into the eastern side of the city and the entire company bogged down. It was actually two companies. It was Team Tank and Team Mech. It was the tanks and the tracks that were out there, and the command element. Well, the track that had the command element communications in it, their radios weren't working that day. So the air officer had effectively no communications with the aircraft overhead. So you need to maintain the comm in the tracks. We'll go more into that communication thing. Amphibious assault vehicles have a very valuable place on the battlefield, but they have to be used in conjunction with the rest of the MAGTAC. They need infantry, armor, and air support. And when you use them together in a team, then you're unbeatable. If you have deployed Marines on a security perimeter, nobody's getting close to a track with an RPG. And I realize that hauling ass around ambush alley, you're not going to ask any Marines to get out and do security. But it sure would have been nice for them to have tanks and Cobra overhead. And we'll address why there weren't Cobras overhead in here. So those are the major lessons that I think that came out of Nasiriyah. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to I think we were watching turn the page. Smart lady. Everything went wrong on March 23rd, 2003, as they were rolling into Nasiriyah. And the first thing that went wrong is another lesson learned, which is really not an AAV lesson, it's a Marine Corps lesson. And that is, the Marines that were moving into the city had very poor intelligence of what was going on in Nasiriyah. They had poor maps, as Gunny Schaefer has said. They didn't know, that was not really a tank trap. I hate to spell what he said. What it was a giant sewer field. It was a drainage field, and it was just a sewer out there. And all the eastern side, which is the slums, all the sewers drained down into that area. And it had rained, so it was even more wet. And then the sun had come out, and there was like 3 inches of hard mud on top of the wet. And when the tanks and tracks rolled into that stuff, they just sank. Sure would have been nice to know that. You know, that's one of the jobs of recon Marines is to go out and test the viability of places that treaded vehicles are going to travel. But we didn't have that luxury in Nazareth. But it's certainly a lesson to be learned that you need to go step on the ground before you drive track vehicles. Okay, the loss of element of surprise. I think that Gunny Schaefer talked a lot about the 507th Maintenance Company, and that was just a tragic accident that I don't think that anybody could have foreseen. There was an incompetent maintenance company commander that drove his 33 vehicles of maintenance soldiers north of the Flot, and he went right by a obviously combat element of the Marine Corps, and just drove right into the city. And what that did was it woke everybody in the city up with a gun. They not only were awake and shooting at the 507th Maintenance Company, but in their eyes, the Americans were retreating. They were winning. And just like Gunny Schaefer said, if you're going to live under Saddam Hussein, and if there's any chance at all that he's going to win, you better be helping him. Because if you're not helping him, you're going to be dead. Okay, so everybody came out, and there went the Marines' lack of surprise. The whole plan was to roll in at sunrise and have ambush alley lined with tracks and both bridges secure before anybody woke up. And then they had planned that and hoped, the leadership did, that whatever forces were there would surrender. The tanks ran out of gas. That's another lesson. Don't exceed your logistics capabilities. Gunny Schaefer didn't touch on this, but they were out of food too. They had ran way ahead of their logistics. And the gasoline situation was dire. It took them a long time. The actual pumps on the trucks didn't work when the tanks went back to refuel, so they would manually refuel their tanks. That's one thing that took them so long. You're going to go into a fight, you want those tanks to be worth it, because the lesson is you need that armor support. Okay, there was also untrained pilots flying overhead. This is not a lesson learned for you, but the pilots were Pennsylvania Air National Guard, and they had never trained on Marine Corps vehicle silhouettes. So they were flying high, they were above 10,000 feet when they came in. And now, all these things have gone wrong, okay? There's no more lack of surprise. The AO, he has no comm because his radio had broken down in his track. The battalion commander had lost situational awareness. He's telling the company commander, Charlie Company, well, you're not where you think you are. So you need to maintain a situational awareness on the battlefield. And it's good to lead from the front, but don't get too far in the front where you lose the situational awareness. So if he had been back on that southern bridge where he could see the battlefield in front of him and communicate, none of this would have happened. So there's no situational awareness, no lack of surprise, no recon, no gas for the tanks. Everything went wrong. But you know something? The Marines at Charlie Company and the few AAV guys that were with them, they fought through it all and they made their objective. Now, Gunny Sergeant Schaefer mentioned that the Cobras had gone forward and they had gone away because there was too much ground fire. Well, that's not how I was. Remember, the air officer has no comms, so he's not communicating with anybody. There was only 2 companies, infantry companies in the battalion that had forward air controllers. And the company that didn't have the forward air controller was Charlie Company. So they didn't have a forward air controller on the ground. They had no way to communicate with their close air support. The only close air support that was being brought in as they were approaching the city was from the tanks. The tank company had FAT, and he was calling in the Cobra fire that took out the zoos and several other things south of the city. But when the tanks went back to refuel, that CAS was lost because it had been controlled by the tanks. Charlie Company did not have a forward air controller. The air officer was out of the fight. The battalion commander was effectively out of the air fight. So when a sortie of A-10 showed up, the forward air controller from Bravo Company, which was stuck in the mud and didn't know that Charlie Company was north of the bridge, he directed the A-10s to take care of anybody that was north of the Strong Canal, assuming that those were enemy fighters. When the pilots saw Sergeant Schaefer heading south in his Kazabac, they assumed that it was an Iraqi mechanized force that was counterattacking the city. So they attacked. And that's what happened. The Cobras were actually over Bravo Company protecting them stuff in the mud. So they never went away, and they never said, oh, there's too much fire, we're leaving. The air group commander, when I interviewed him after the fight for my book, said that every one of his Cobras came back shot up that day. Every one of them. They all had bullet holes. Okay. So Nasiriyah, this is Charlie 211. Now, what is phenomenal is that that entire company made it through Ambush Alley, that 3-kilometer drive that Benny Schaefer described. He was in the front shooting and just trying to stay alive and dodge RPGs and enemy fire. I guess it's pretty hard to dodge an RPG with a track, but he was ducking the place. It wasn't until the last track, starting 211, they were the trailing track, went through the city, that it got hit by an RPG. And the driver, he drove that halfway through the city. He accelerated as fast as he could, drove the remaining distance through the city, past some other tracks as he was going. He wasn't waiting for anybody, he was getting behind. And he stopped it in the middle of the road north of the city, and it burned. And this is after the fight. Aluminum doesn't do so well in hot fires. Fortunately, nobody was killed in that gun. Gunny Schaefer told me his story about Nasiriyah, and I don't have to say any more about it, other than I don't have the capability to select what photograph goes on the cover of my book. So the publisher picked this. Gunny Schaefer was thrilled that it ended up being on the cover of the book. It's a great photo. This is Charlie 208 again, and the impact of this photograph is not as it should be. The profile photograph that Gunny Schaefer had is much better, because you look forward and you think you see vehicle. Well, that's the tank retriever. That's not the vehicle. And this is where the majority of Marines died when Nasiriyah was in this track, and it was hit by a Hellfire missile. A-10s. And what's amazing is that the driver and the track commander got out of here. And, I was going to tell you that story today, but Gunny Schaefer did a good job. It was actually the tankers that came to rescue them. They drove through the city and saw the Alamo. One of the tankers stopped for a second, and he said, "What do you need?" And they said, "We need batteries for our radio." Because the Morse code they were doing. So the tanker threw down some batteries and I think a couple bottles of water, and then kept going north. Turns out the batteries weren't the right kind of batteries at all. But he turned around and came back later and evacuated all the wounded. An interesting part of that story is there was a small group from Charlie Company led by, at the time, I believe, Lieutenant Brian Latendra. He was the weapons and attached to Charlie Company. And they went back in the city with 2 tanks and several Humvees to pull all these Marines out. And they turned around and they went through a hail of gunfire to get down there, and a hail of gunfire to get back. And when they got back up north, they realized that they had left one guy behind. So Brian Latendra and the Humvees had to go back. They didn't go back to the tanks next time. I think it was 2 Humvees to go back. And raced across that northern bridge again and went and retrieved that last Marine. Brian Latendra was killed in 2006 on Mother's Day. He survived this battle and was a hero of this battle, and then we lost him later. Okay, let's move on to Fallujah. Now remember, General Matansky had led the brigade, and he saw all these things happen in Nasiriyah. He experienced them. So he wasn't about to have the same thing happen in Fallujah. So the first thing, well, Fallujah was a stronghold, an enemy stronghold of the insurgents. Al-Musab al-Zarqawi, the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, had moved to Fallujah early in 2004 and was running the Al-Qaeda insurgency from Fallujah. They found training centers and propaganda mills that were in IED factories in Fallujah. When they cleared it out, that was all Al-Qaeda based stuff. He basically went into Fallujah. We don't have a map of Fallujah anymore. But the entire southern half of the city was told the people to get out. They were taking that. People disagreed with Al-Qaeda taking their homes. They drove them out in the street and shot and killed them. So it was an Al-Qaeda stronghold. There were many non-Arab insurgents that were in Fallujah. Let me just give you a quick talk about the first fight in Fallujah and how it ended up being such a big fight in the second fight. Everyone remembers how they imagined that there were Blackwater security contractors that were ambushed and killed in Fallujah, and then 2 of the bodies were burned and then hung from the western bridge in Fallujah. This was only 2 weeks after the Marines had returned to Iraq in 02, I guess it was. And General Mattis was the head of the 1st Marine Division at the time, General Conway of the MEF. And they appealed to their leadership in Baghdad and back in the Pentagon after this ambush and brutal killing and display of American bodies. They appealed to the leadership and said, we just got here. We have plans for Fallujah. One of the things that we need to do is we need to pacify the people. We need to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people and kill the insurgents. Please do not order us to attack the Fallujah. Well, George Bush, and this is lesson for lots higher than you know, George Bush and his war cabinet decided that the image of American bodies being strung from a bridge in Iraq was too much like what happened in Somalia, and that wouldn't happen again. And I'm not certain if George Bush and the upper decision makers, ever even received the recommendations from General Mattis in the 1st Marine Division. But they ordered an immediate attack into Fallujah to avenge the deaths of those Blackwater soldiers and to clear the city. I'm going to tell you a story because it shows the need for infantry support. Although this is a tank story, it's just as true for anthrax. One of the first units to go into the city went into the northwestern section. It's called the Jolan district. And it's very, very dense there and full of insurgents. and the infantry group went in and they sustained a few casualties and they called for medevac and a quick reaction force. Then Gunnery Sergeant Nick Popovich from 1st Tanks, he and one of his other tankers were part of a quick reaction force that reacted and drove into the city. As soon as the tanks got into the city and they started using their heavy weapons, the resistance faded away, the Marines were able to evacuate their casualties, and Gunny Pop stayed in the city all night with the Marines around him as security watch, fending off attacks from insurgents. This was the first night of the first battle of Fallujah. The next morning, the insurgents attacked again. They tended to go to ground at night because they knew we had such awesome night vision capabilities. So the next morning, the insurgents attacked Gunny Pop's position again, and he decided, without any other recommendations from above, that he was going to go and chase these insurgents. So he, with his one tank and his wingman, they went driving, roaming the streets of Fallujah, just kicking ass and taking names. I mean, they did a great job. They got back to their position, were ordered to hold because he was almost out of ammunition, and they were attacked again. And he moved forward a couple of blocks. By now, the insurgents had him numbered, and they enticed him down ever narrower streets till he finally turned a corner onto a narrow street, and he looked up in the 3rd story, and there's an insurgent with an RPG. Just almost close to enough to touch him. And he shot that RPG. Gunny Pop ducked down into his tank. The RPG hit his hatch and exploded. Knocked out both of his eyes. They managed to put one back in, and he's got a little bit of eyesight now. He was evacuated. But the whole reason for me telling you this story is that armored vehicles do great against other armored vehicles, but in an urban environment, you need infantry support. Okay, and that's why I'm telling that story. Don't go into a heavy urban environment without some Marines on the ground around you. Okay, so General Natonski knows about Nasiriyah, and now he's preparing for going back in. And the insurgents had the entire summer, because it was April for the first battle, and we didn't go in until November. So the insurgents built up, they fortified the city of Fallujah, they spread out propaganda around the world. We beat the Marines in Fallujah. Come to Fallujah and kill Americans. And insurgents swarmed in from all over the world. There were insurgents from Chechnya, there were from Egypt, Syria, lots of Syrians. They swarmed in from everywhere to fight the good fight, the jihad. They were going to die and get their conversion. So the entire summer was spent with the enemy building up the fortifications in Fallujah. General Natonski, when he took command mid-summer, he realized this, and from his experience in Nasiriyah, he said, I'm not sending Marines and tracks and in on their own on the ground. I need a heavy armor force to punch through these fortifications. Every building up the perimeter, there was sandbag, there was IEDs on the streets. General Natonski told me the story that they dropped a bomb on an air mission on one of the major thoroughfares, and there were secondary explosions for a mile down the street. There were so many IEDs. So the place was fortified hornets. So he went to the Army. He said, I need some more armor. And the Army sent in 2 mechanized battalions, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, which was primarily tanks. It was 2 tank companies and a Bradley company, and 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry, which really only showed up with a Bradley company and some tanks. And they led the attack into the city. And then he followed the tracks to bring the Marines into the city, and then the Marines, as you heard, were relegated to missions of logistics support in Kazakhstan. Because that's the right use for them. Now, some of the Marines on the ground were very creative and used their tracks in the middle of their logistic journeys to just pull up next to walls or tall buildings so the Marines could climb up and do top-down clearing. A lot of times they used the tracks to just push over the outer walls of houses to get inside. Because every house in Fallujah was a mini fort. They were concrete buildings surrounded, that courtyard was surrounded by a cinder block concrete wall with metal gates. And what the insurgents would do is they would hide in these buildings. Again, you heard a little bit about that. They would just wait for the Americans to show up. So at the beginning of the second battle, the Marines were brought in. They started clearing the houses. They would enter rooms, and they would get shot up. So they got smarter toward the end. They got D9 bulldozers and bulldozed houses when they got shot at from the side. They would do clearing by fire and other things. But so they started using the tracks to push over walls and things like that. So in an urban environment, they can be used. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where they actually were used in Fallujah. And again, I told you that they brought Marines from the northern staging areas down to the edge of the city. That was very valuable. It saved Marines' lives because they were under mortar fire, and there was lots of minefields, and protected the individual infantrymen in their approach to the city. And then, on the second night of the battle, there were two Marine regiments that were involved in the second battle of Fallujah. The 1st Marine Regiment was on the western side of the city in the Jolan district with 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, and 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Excuse me, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, and 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. And the 7th Marine Regiment was on the eastern side of the city with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. Well, 1/8, RCT-1 was main. RCT-7 was a supporting effort. But within RCT-7, their main effort was to capture the government center that you saw in the map. It's right in the center of the city. It is the government center. It was the center of the resistance. And we wanted to take that. It sat on the northern edge of the east-west route called Michigan. And getting to Michigan was the first phase of the invasion of Fallujah, the first half. So they wanted to take the government center, and they wanted to do it in a fairly dynamic attack. So what they did was they took a company of Marines and put them all in AAVs and gave them a platoon of tanks. And in the middle of the night, they drove from the northern edge of the city at full speed down through the city streets with an AC-130 in overwatch and tanks in the lead, and they smashed through the northern walls of the government center and took the government center in the middle of the night. Virtually no shots were fired, and it was a very successful mission. A great use for AAVs to get Marines where they need to go rapidly, but they had the right support. They had an AC-130 overhead, and they had tanks all over. So I wanted to tell you about that and how they avoided the pitfalls of using AAVs in the urban area. So now the 1/8's in the government center. And before the sun comes up, they want to send a platoon of Marines across Michigan to set up a support by fire position to support their attack across Michigan later that next day. The platoon gets over there and finds a hornet's nest of insurgents. They get in a really heavy firefight. Start sustaining casualties. Let's go. No. I got it. They start sustaining casualties, so they said, well, we're going to send an armored Casaback over. We'll get it, First Sergeant's AAV. So they get the First Sergeant's AAV. It was First Sergeant Fry. Somebody told me he's now Sergeant Major Fry. you're in Canada doing something. So First Sergeant Fry is in the back of the track, and they're driving. They drive out onto Michigan, getting ready to go cross over and go get the casualties, and they get hit in the thruster can. Is that what it's called? The thrusters in the back. The bucket. The RPG goes right through the bucket and into the troop compartment and explodes. Track starts burning. First Sergeant Fry goes up to the track command and says, the track's on fire. They all jump out, nobody gets hurt. Later that afternoon, a couple hours later, the entire company decides that they're now going to attack across Michigan. And a Marine comes up to First Sergeant Fry and says, First Sergeant, we got you to the track. And he said, fuck you, I'm walking. And yeah, one more. There it is. It completely burned down the top. Now we need that. This is what the Jovan district looked like. Very, very beautiful. Yes, we can. It's very, very compact. You know, that was good. I had another photograph and I forgot to put it in, but the other photograph was taken from the tank just in back of them, and there was infantry on both sides of the street and they're moving forward with the tanks. Again, even with tanks, I mean, the infantry support. Okay, come back on to both sides. And let's go to the So leaders, learn how to employ your AAVs to empower your Marines and withhold them. AAVs are a unique asset that you're not going to find anywhere else in any military outfit. And they're a necessary asset in the Marine. So maintain them, and always remember that they will have a role in that attack. And remember, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I want to thank Richard for taking his time out of his business schedule to come down. Obviously, a true expert in Iraq, and actually Marine Corps operations there in Costa Rica and Fallujah. Had a couple plugs. We had a book signing out here in the lobby at 12:30. That's right now in the lobby, excuse me, at 12:30 at the bookstore at Headnut Point. Is that correct? At the Marine shop, go over there if it's super crazy here. And we got just something small token of appreciation for taking time out of your business schedules. Richard Lowry, guest speaker, Operation Iraqi Freedom, professional military education for the Marines. So second us hopefully the time. Thank you for your lighting. Anybody answer that? Shit! Alright, hey, let me bring up the Gunnies. Gunny Shaper. Gunny Cheryl. Come on up. Come on up. Gunny, this Cheryl. He's doing your analysis right now? He was. Come on out. Hey, one thing, some of y'all know, to go over some of these stories, years and years of research by Richard. We're totally grateful for him coming down and talking to us, but also the personal experiences in combat, especially, I'll say loved ones. Loved ones, your brothers that made the ultimate sacrifice. It's very difficult. I was not expecting that. I was expecting a more academic, some personal experiences. From the Gunnies, they gave us something much, much more. And for that, they really, really appreciate it and just give them a full round of applause. This morning is about us. It's about being Marine sailors, about being stronger, getting that resilience. And we talk about NCOs. That's what's making it happen. And multiple lessons learned that Richard's given us. But Sergeant Major and I were talking about one thing that everybody's talked about, and I want to just triple tap, is be prepared for anything, anytime. If you're not training for war right now, you're going to be not surprised. And many times we're doing something new across the board. So be prepared. Take care of your Marines, take care of each other, take care of yourself. All right, and one last thing, this is in honor of our fallen Marines, but also our heroes. All the heroes that we discussed today, all our trackers, all the Marines and sailors who served in 2nd, 3rd, or 4th tracks during OIF, throughout the theater, please rise. Please rise. Don't be embarrassed. All the trackers who served in the times, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, it's all theater time, please rise. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, these are our heroes. Give them all. Give them all. All right, at this time, Sergeant Major 5. Sir. Take 5, we're not making head calls. We need everybody here, so just go ahead and stand. We got to adjust some things right here. We got a little award ceremony we want to do. So go ahead and stand up and relax.